Thank you for your patience. It's good to see such a great turnout today. I hope we have a wonderful evening. On behalf of the Department of Religion Studies and the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Johannesburg, I welcome you to today's discussion, Exploring Religious Belief, a Muslim Atheist Conversation. You will have noted that we are envisioning today's event as a conversation, a discussion, not a debate per se. We find ourselves in an academic setting, and the purpose of this singular space, the academy, is to foster good faith conversations, often difficult ones, about life's deepest and most important questions. This is where we can engage in free and open dialogue in the spirit of seeking.
I don't know how to get the light.
In the spirit of seeking truth. That was a spirit there. I don't know how to get the light on. Not imposing our views on others, and certainly not censoring the views of those with whom we disagree. We also find ourselves in Africa, a continent with the rich philosophies around the importance of fostering communal dialogue around matters of great importance. And the matter of religious belief is of great importance, is it not? Indeed, we can consider religion to be that quintessentially human activity of engaging with matters of ultimate importance. But it will not have escaped the attention of anyone in this room that the approaches and answers to these questions widely differ. And where we have such wide divergences, conflict can result, and has resulted time and time again throughout human history. Today we take one small step toward perhaps breaking this cycle, but let us not be naive, it won't be easy. Religious questions arise from the very core of what it means to be human. You may vehemently disagree with one or more or all of the speakers today, even the chair. But I hope you can find the courage to accept that free and open conversations about truth must be fostered if humanity has any chance of moving toward a new, more tolerant and tolerable future. With that said, allow me to briefly introduce you to our four esteemed panelists. Hamza Andreas Jordis is the founder and CEO of the Sapiens Institute. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Divine Reality, God, Islam, and the Mirage of Atheism, which has been translated into over 10 languages. He has a Master's of Research degree, an MA, and a postgraduate certificate in philosophy from the University of London. He is currently pursuing his PhD on the Quran and its verses pertaining to nature. He has studied Islamic thought and theology under qualified scholars. Hamza has spoken at many universities all around the world. He has debated prominent academics and thinkers on Islam and atheism. His interlocutors have included Professor Lawrence Krauss, Professor Peter Simons, Dan Barker, and Professor Simon Blackburn. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Muhammad Ijab is an author, comparative religionist, and philosopher of religion. He is co-founder of the Sapiens Institute and is a researcher and instructor for the organization. He has a BA in politics and a master's degree in history. He has also acquired a second master's in Islamic studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He has also completed a third master's degree in applied theology from the University of Oxford, where he focused on the philosophy of religion in applied settings. He is now doing his PhD in the philosophy of religion on the contingency argument for God's existence. In addition, he has undergone formal training in Islamic studies with a focus on the Quran, prophetic traditions, and legal reasoning. He has completed Islamic seminary courses and has been given formal permission to relay Islamic knowledge on selected Islamic fields. He is one of the very few Muslim public figures who deal comparatively with political, philosophical, and theological issues, and as such has amassed a following of many subscribers on YouTube in English and Arabic. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Aaron Fasser, is a practicing advocate and member of the Johannesburg Bar, and a self-described philosophy enthusiast. Aaron graduated from the University of the Witwatersrand in 2007 with a BA cum laude, and in 2009 with an LLB cum laude. Aaron has also graduated with an MA in Applied Ethics cum laude in 2017 and has an MA in Philosophy cum laude in 2019. He has also been awarded his LLM International Law cum laude in 2021 at the University of the Witwatersrand. He has appeared in a number of cases that have been reported in the South African law reports. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Last but not least, we welcome Mark Oppenheimer. He is a practicing advocate and a member of the Johannesburg Bar. He has appeared in the Supreme Court of Appeal and the Constitutional Court in a series of cases that seek to determine the boundary between freedom of expression and genuine hate speech. He has authored submissions to Parliament on the hate speech bill and to the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on Escalating Racial Tensions. He is co-author of the Conversations About Philosophy book series and hosts the popular philosophy series Brain in a Vat. We are happy to have you here. Welcome. Here quickly is the format of today's event. We will start, of course, with me giving you this introduction. Once I'm done, each of the panelists will present for 15 minutes each. We will then move to an internal discussion amongst the panelists that should go for around 30 minutes. Then we will have a more open discussion. That session will be around 25 minutes. That will include our esteemed panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. They will respond and get the conversation rolling in a different, or continue the direction that was started with the internal discussion. And then we'll let you, the audience, ask questions and comments for around 15 minutes. And may I please ask you to keep it brief and concise and, of course, civil. And we will end with a quick fire round. Each of the panelists can conclude in 1 minute. Just give us your concluding thoughts. I will send you off, but before that we have some gifts for the panelists. Once those gifts are given off, I will thank all of you, and we will all go home hungry. That is my hope. Hungry for more conversations about these matters of vital importance. So with that said, let me introduce you to the panelists, and then we'll get the ball formally rolling. To my left, I have the head of department and senior lecturer in philosophy, Dr. Chad Wynne Harris. Welcome. And then we have Dr. Shahid Mati, senior lecturer at the Department of Religion Studies. Welcome. We are going to go straight into the panel discussion now, which should last us around 40 minutes. And we are going to begin by agreement of the panelists that we will start with Aaron Fasser. So Aaron Fasser, your 15 minutes begin now. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about these matters of all importance.
Thank you. I would just like to start by thanking the organizers of this event, namely the Philosophy of Religion and the Religious Studies Department of the University of Johannesburg, as well as the Sapiens Institute. It's a great privilege to share the stage with such esteemed, learned interlocutors. Conversations like this are vitally important, not only because the topics that arise are themselves intellectually stimulating, but because they allow us all an opportunity to gain some insight into the worldviews and beliefs of people vastly different from ourselves. This attempt to deepen one's understanding is at the heart of philosophical discourse. The philosopher Gyula Klima captures the nature of what we're doing here tonight, and he sums it up in a quote. unless one is able to learn to think and live with the concepts of another person and thought objects constituted by them, one will always fail to have a real grasp on the meaning of the other person. This, however, need not mean that people can understand only those persons all whose beliefs they share. What is required for proper understanding is rather the ability to let the other person's beliefs constitute one's own universe of thought objects, trying to achieve a fusion of the horizons. This can be done, however, only in a long dialectical process, which may take adjusting the beliefs of either party. We should not seek sheer winning of a debate, for that is the concern of sophists, but to win over the other to one's belief, and or to be won over to the other's belief, for the sake of what is true and good. But this, of course, requires openness, patience, and respect from both parties. Indeed, this requires that attitude which defines our profession, the love of wisdom. So with that in mind, I'd like to address two aspects in my opening address. The first relates to my understanding of tonight's discussion topic and the concept of rationality. The second relates to my reasons for thinking that atheism is a more rational philosophical position than Islamic theism. The topic for discussion this evening is atheism or Islam, which is more rational. However, what are we to understand by the term rational? There are, broadly speaking, two concepts of rationality that need to be disambiguated. The first is alethic or epistemic rationality, which is concerned with truth tracking, and that set of reasons or justifications which properly bear on the truth or falsity of someone's belief. The second is pragmatic rationality, which is concerned with the utility of a given set of beliefs in achieving a person's stated goals. It is my understanding that the principal concern this evening is in determining whether atheism or Islam is more rational in the alethic or epistemic sense rather than the pragmatic sense. Accordingly, I understand this evening's topic is about whether there is greater epistemic reason to believe that atheism or Islamic theism is true. So why do I believe that atheism is true? Before I can do that, I need to get some definitions on the table so that we're all clear about what we're talking about. By God, I understand to be the single, necessary, transcendent, supernatural, immaterial, non-physical person that exists that is to say independently, and is essentially omniperfect. He's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and thus worthy of worship, and who is the creator, designer, and sustainer of the natural world. Atheism is the thesis that the proposition God exists is false. Theism is the thesis that the proposition God exists is true. Naturalism is the thesis that the proposition only the natural world exists is true. Naturalists are committed to the idea that 1, there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers. And 2, our best, most well-established science is the best touchstone for what those natural causal entities and items are. Naturalism logically entails that natural reality exhausts global causal reality, and it logically entails atheism. However, atheism does not logically entail naturalism. Supernaturalism is the thesis that the proposition only the natural world exists is false. Supernaturalism posits a bifurcated ontological view of reality. Theism entails supernaturalism, however, supernaturalism does not entail theism. Supernaturalism is committed to all the causal entities that the naturalist is committed to, plus the existence of non-natural causal items with non-natural causal powers. Supernaturalism thus entails that global causal reality is not exhausted by natural reality. By Islamic theism, I understand this to be the idea, the claim that God, as I've defined him, also has the property of having progressively revealed through the Archangel Gabriel the contents of the Quran to Muhammad, and which contents are the final and definitive revelation for mankind. Islamic theism logically entails theism. Theism does not logically entail Islamic theism. I am an atheist and a naturalist. I reject theism, and a fortiori I reject Islamic theism, for two principal reasons. First, the arguments for the existence of God are philosophically unpersuasive. We can call this the negative reason. Second, there are, in my view, persuasive arguments for atheism and for naturalism. This is the affirmative reason. The negative reason flows from the fact that atheism is justified in virtue of the failure to infer God's existence in circumstances where one would rationally expect his existence to be inferable. Absence of evidence can indeed be evidence of absence, justifying the conclusion that something does not exist. This will be the case provided at least two conditions are jointly met. First, if the thing X exists, then there would be evidence of X's existence. And 2, we have conducted an exhaustive search for the evidence in the areas where such evidence ought reasonably to be found. When applied to God, condition 1 is generally accepted by all parties to the discussion. After all, if God does exist, then we all, atheists and theists alike, rationally expect there to be evidence of his existence, given the sort of being God is supposed to be. If we do not rationally expect evidence of his existence were he to actually exist, then it is quite difficult, if not impossible, to see how one could rationally argue for his existence in the first place. In fact, the project of natural theology assumes that there would be evidence of God's existence, and if he were to exist, that we can in fact marshal that evidence. Condition 2, when applied to God, amounts to dealing with the best arguments from natural theology. These are the theistic arguments that often invoke the input and insights of contemporary science, that are supposed to take up the mantle and provide the positive evidence from which to infer God's existence. Examples include the cosmological argument, the contingency argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, etc. We can proffer the following deductive argument which takes the above considerations into account. Premise 1. If God exists, then there is compelling evidence from which to infer either deductively or non-deductively his existence. In other words, the arguments from natural theology are sound. Premise 2. There is no compelling evidence from which to infer either deductively or non-deductively God's existence, i.e. the arguments of natural theology are not sound. Therefore, premise 3, conclusion, therefore God does not exist. The argument is logically valid. Of course, theists will vehemently deny the soundness of premise 2. That's where the action is, so to speak. And it means that the theist must offer positive reasons from which to infer God's existence. If there is no evidence for God when we ought rationally expect there to be evidence, then we are within our epistemic rights to conclude that God does not exist and that atheism is true. The affirmative reason for atheism is tied to a panoply of positive arguments. Because of time constraints, I can't deal with all of them. I'm going to list the family of arguments, and then I'm going to provide one specific argument that I think is quite powerful. The first family of arguments seeks to demonstrate a logical incoherence in the very concept of God, either because a supposed divine property of God taken on its own is logically impossible, or because some set of supposed divine properties is logically incompossible. The second family of arguments seeks to demonstrate that the existence of God is logically incompossible with the existence of certain undeniable facts about the natural world. For example, 1, the existence of horrendous evil and suffering in the world, or 2, the existence of non-resistant non-believers, or 3, the existence of doxastic discord and religious heterogeneity. The third sort of argument is non-deductive in character, and seeks to demonstrate not that the existence of God is incompossible with these facts, but rather that the existence of God is a poor explanatory hypothesis, when the aforegoing facts and others besides are taken into consideration, cumulative consideration. The idea is that on a conspectus of all the relevant data, the naturalistic hypothesis explains the data better than the theistic hypothesis. It is obvious that if one has a choice between two competing theories, and the one is better at explaining the relevant data, then it is more rational to accept that theory. What then constitutes a better theory or explanation? I contend that it is one that has the greatest explanatory scope and depth, while also being the most parsimonious. The core idea is that naturalism can explain all the relevant data at least as well as theism, and it is by its very nature more parsimonious than theism. After all, theism posits the natural world plus something more. I contend that naturalism can explain the existence of the universe, the so-called fine-tuning of the universe, consciousness and morality at least as well as theism can. Furthermore, naturalism can better explain a host of more specific facts about reality that are not well explained by the theistic hypothesis. For example, and I've already alluded to this, the scope, distribution, and quantity of horrendous suffering in the world, both animal and human. 2, the existence of non-resistant non-believers. 3, the existence of doxastic discord in the form of widespread religious heterogeneity. And 4, the continued and repeated success of naturalistic explanations in displacing supernaturalistic explanations over the course of human history. Turning then to the specific argument that I'd like to present. There are many more, but time constraints only permit this one. It's the form of the logical argument from evil presented by J.L. Schellenberg, and what he calls the new logical argument from evil. J.L. Schellenberg explains the central thrust of this version of the argument to be the following, quote, "Theists must rationalize from God without evil prior to creation," prior here may be taken logically or temporally or in both senses, "to God with evil after. No such transition, so it may be argued, is metaphysically possible. The key thought can be put in the form of a slogan. In any possible world, including God, once purely good, always purely good. What we have here is something like the theological analog of Newton's first law of motion. Another way of putting it is no evil before creation, no evil after. The premises of the argument are as follows. 1. God is unsurpassably great. 2. God is ontologically independent of any world that he creates. 3. Prior to any world being created, there is no evil in God of any kind. There are only divine goods. This is the prior purity of God. Therefore, 4. Every possible non-divine good is greatly exceeded by a good of the same type existing in God prior to the world. Therefore, 5. Every worldly good is greatly exceeded by a good of the same type existing in God prior to the creation of the world. 5. Therefore, every worldly good, 6. All goods found in God prior to the world are pure goods. They are goods that exist without any evil whatsoever. 7. Therefore, every worldly good is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the existence of the world. Therefore, 8. Every worldly good that may permit or require evil is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the world. Therefore, 9. If every worldly good that permits or requires evil is greatly exceeded by a pure good of the same type existing in God prior to the world, then any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by any world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God. Therefore, 10. Any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by any world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God. This would be a greater world. God can ensure the existence of such greater worlds and can do so limitlessly. Therefore, if A, any world containing goods permitting or requiring evil is greatly exceeded by a world modeling the corresponding pure goods in God, and B, the existence of greater worlds can limitlessly be ensured by God, then for any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create X rather than world Y. For any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create world X rather than world Y. Therefore, 14. If for any world X that requires or permits evil, there is some greater world Y that models pure goodness in God, such that God has no good reason or justification to create X rather than Y, then God has no good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 15. Therefore, God has no good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 16. But if there is evil in the world, then God has good reason or justification to permit evil in the world. 17. Therefore, there is no evil in the world. 18. However, as we all know, there is evil in the world. 19. The conclusion. Therefore, there is both evil and not evil in the world, which is a contradiction. As J.L. Schellenberg concludes, having derived this contradiction in the way that we have, it follows that the conjunction of the three commitments of theism mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, unsurpassable greatness, ontological independence, and prior purity, are logically consistent with a fourth undeniable fact, namely the existence of evil in the world. That concludes in essence my presentation, and obviously I look forward to discussing the merits on the details of those arguments in the course of our discussion. Thank you very much.
Next, as per agreement of the panel, we will hear from Mohammed Hijab. Let me just stop that, restart. Please go ahead.
Let's suppose there is no God. Let's suppose there is no omniscient one, no omnipotent one, no all-knowledgeable one, no all-powerful one, no necessary being. Let's suppose, no problem. What do we have? What are the explanations that we have? That the universe came from nothing. But we know from nothing, nothing comes, because nothing is the absence of something. that the universe is self-generated. But we know that that's a contradiction, because the universe cannot generate itself, exist and not exist at the same time. So what do we know? What do we know? We know there exists a universe. We know I exist. We know you exist. We know Oppenheimer exists. And Faisal exists. And hopefully there's not going to be explosions today. Except of the argument that we've just heard. And I will say that when you know that the dependent existences exist, you have two options. Either you have a chain, a finite chain. A depends on B, or B depends on A, C depends on B. In which case A is the beginning of that chain. We, the Muslims, call that the necessary being, the independent one, God. Obviously the atheist cannot subscribe to that theory. Let's move away from that one, please. So what do we have left? We have an infinite chain. An infinite chain of dependent things. But an infinite chain of dependent things is an absurd proposition. The reason being, because if this was actualized in the actual world, for example, through an infinite amount of multiverses, then it would imply that the inexhaustible has been exhausted. The unlimited has been limited, which is a contradiction, which is absurd. It would also imply that infinite sets exist within infinite sets, which means that the part is equivalent to the whole, but the part is defined by most mereologists as a portion of the whole, which is an absurdity itself and a contradiction. So let's suppose God doesn't exist. What can you atheists actually present and put on the table? You've got nothing. And the best Mr. Faisal could actually put to the table is to say, naturalism can explain just as well, he says. He's not even trying to say it's better. He's trying for equality. He's got a Nelson Mandela approach to the situation. He does. But so do I, in a different manner. Because in an intellectual way, we will conclude, therefore, that a necessary being through which everything depends upon is independent in and of itself, and everything depends upon is the only way to make sense of dependent things. You see, contingent things cannot exist within necessary things. A contingent thing is possible, can exist or not exist. A necessary thing is not possible, it's impossible not to exist. In other words, contingencies cannot exist within necessities. The existence of dependent things, the existence of this young man here, the handsome one, and Oppenheimer, his forefathers led to a lot of people's non-existence. Not your forefathers, but you know, the other Oppenheimer. Their existence indicates without shadow of a doubt that a necessary being is required. So what kind of necessary being is this? We know I'm different to him, and we know he's different to him, and we know you're different to him. Differentiation indicates possibility and contingency. And wherein there is differences and possibility and contingency therein, there must be an explanation for this. And what is the explanation for this? Islamic theism says, an external sorting agent, which specified and particularized things to be a certain manner, which indicates a choice had to be made. And this, we would say, indicates a chooser, a willer, which we would say is the will of God. So already we've identified that you have to have something which is independent and necessary, post-eternal and pre-eternal, to break away from the infinities and have a will. What do we call that? We call that God. Yes, we do. And it's the only explanation that doesn't lead to contradiction and absurdity. I challenge anybody here today to give me another explanation that doesn't lead to contradiction and absurdity. You see, I finished quite early
We have about 10 minutes.
I've got more to say. I've got more to say, which is, okay, you say fine. I understand the situation. I agree with you, no problem. But why do you say that Islam is true? Before we get there, one more prerequisite must be made. How could there be only one of these? How come there's not three? For example, the triune situation. Because if there was an individuating factor that individuated and differentiated necessary being A from necessary being B, that would render either or both of them contingent. Because a contingent thing is differentiated in reality. And a necessary being cannot be differentiated from something else. But I'll give you an easier argument, which is the Quranic argument. مَا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ مِنْ وَلَدٍ وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ بِمَا خَلَقَ وَلَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. Chapter 23, verse 91, that there couldn't be more than one God effectively because they would outstrip one another in power. There cannot be more than one overall power because an all-powerful agent by definition, yes, means that he has power over all other things. Nothing can supervene on his power capabilities. Moreover, there cannot be more than one overall will. لو كان فيهما آلهة إلا الله لفسدتا. In chapter 21, verse number 22. If there was in them, i.e. the heavens and the earth, more than one, the heavens and the earth would have been corrupt. Meaning what? You have to have one overriding will. Because it had been more than one will, it wouldn't be consistent. You couldn't explain the uniformity, the regularity, the stability of the universe. Because there is uniformity, stability, and regularity. Without it, you couldn't even do science. And there is uniformity, stability, and regularity to the extent which it allows life to exist on the universe. That's a fact no one here will deny. There is life on the universe, and that the universe is uniform and regular and stable enough to allow such life to exist. What is the best explanation for this? One singular overarching will that doesn't lead to conflict. So that's why it's one God. But what about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Now there's many things I can say, and in 7 minutes I'll just mention one evidence. There are necessary and sufficient conditions for a word of God to be conceived as such, the word of God. I would put to the table today that one of the necessary conditions is that this cannot contain any contradictions. We are logicians here, we all... The Quran says if this was from other than God, it would have been many contradictions inside of it. لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. The Quran, this is one of the necessary conditions. It's one of the only books to even posit this challenge. Religious books. Which is find the contradiction within it. Secondly, it's inimitable. Thirdly, it's preserved. We will argue all these points. However, what's the sufficient condition? I give you one argument and one argument only. Which is the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now I am claiming here, and I'm willing to be challenged today, that the prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are the most accurate and numerous and frequent that come from an integrous source and unambiguous in human history. These five criterion that I've just mentioned, if you apply them to any other historical figure, it will collapse. For example, if you look at the Bible, Mark chapter number 13, you'll find that it says in one generation the heavens and the earth will be destroyed. Nostradamus made a prediction that in 177 years there will be famine and war and so on. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made the following predictions. For example, I'll give you some. That the barefooted Arabs يَتَطَاوَلُونَ فِي الْبُنْيَانِ, that they will compete to see who creates the highest buildings. Now, we're seeing that the highest building in the world is in Burj Khalifa. How could the economic capabilities of these nations be such that if someone wanted to argue this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, that it was such? It couldn't be. Number two, that the Prophet ﷺ predicted the fall, the downfall of the Persian and the Roman Empire, the two greatest empires of that time, spanning millennia. Not only that the Muslims would overtake those empires. Number three, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ predicted the invasions of the Mongols. And I'm ready to give all the primary sources. This is very well known in the Islamic tradition. He told us how the Mongols would invade, and one of the biggest battles in Muslim history was Ain Jalut in 1260. The sacking of Baghdad was in 1258, and this is all connected to the prophecies of the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us what kind of world we'll be living in. He said, the world in the future will be such that there will be so much interest. مَنْ لَمْ يَأْكُلْهُ أَصَابَتْهُ مِنْ غُبَارٍ. Whoever doesn't consume the interest, he will be affected by its dust. We're living in an economic system, the whole thing is interest, women busters, perpetuated or exacerbated at least by the interest systems of the banks. And I think South Africa is no different. Number 5, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us that there will be an advent of sexually transmitted diseases due to an increased fornication. Number 6, the Prophet ﷺ told us that women will go into the workforce. Yes, I'm not sure if any of you have heard this one. حتى تعين المرأة زوجها في التجارة. This is a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The woman will involve herself in business with her husband. This is a prophetic hadith. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ even told us about obesity that will become a phenomenon within his ummah. And many people in this room, I'm only kidding, says, you see what I mean? The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us exactly where Islam is going to spread. زُوِيَ لِيَ الْأَرْضِ, he said, فَرَأَيْتُ مَشْرِقَهَا وَمَغَرِبَهَا وَإِنَّ أُمَّتِي سَيَبْلُغُ مُلْكُهَا مَا زُوِيَ لِي مِنْهَا. That the earth has been projected to me and I saw its eastern parts and western parts, and all of the ummah will take what has been projected. Why does he say east and west and not north and south? Look at the map. He told us exactly where Islam will spread. He said it will go to Sindh al-Hind. It will go to India and Pakistan. He told us it will go to Egypt. He told us it will go to Asham, Jordan and Lebanon and these countries. Yemen. How could somebody get this so right? There's been no figure in human history who has predicted with such frequency and unambiguity the events of the future as Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And these are just some examples. I could go on for 2 hours. And books have been written. Volumes, voluminous books have been written. Encyclopedic, compendious, voluminous books have been written on the issue. I'm not going to talk about that today. I've just given you as much as you need. Now to respond to my interlocutor quickly. He's talking about the problem of evil. He had 2 arguments effectively. One of them was disagreement, religious disagreement. Effectively, and I don't want to straw man and make it correct, saying the existence of religious disagreement means there's no God. What the hell is this? Sorry to say. وَلَوْ شَاءَ رَبُّكَ لَجَعَلَ النَّاسَ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. Quran says, if Allah wanted, He could have made the people one people. وَلَا يَزَالُونَ مُخْتَلَفِينَ. And they are in fact continually disagreeing. وَلِذَلِكَ إِلَّا مَنْ رَحِمَ رَبُّكَ. Except for who Allah has rahmah on. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. And that's the reason why He created them in the first place. He created you as a test, my friend, to see of you which is going to be good and bad. وَلِذَلِكَ خَلَقَهُمْ. This is no argument against us. This is actually in line with God's wisdom and mercy. And He says evil, the problem of evil, which we've heard 1,000 times before. I disbelieve in evil. How about that? I believe evil is privation. I don't believe evil is substratum. Put evil under a microscope. Atheists, tell me where evil is. Evil is privation, is the lacking of God's goodness. That's what I say evil is. Tell me where evil is. Let me use empirical value judgment to show where the substance of evil is. Evil doesn't exist. How about that? As an atheist, you don't believe in God, but you believe in evil. But you can't put evil under a microscope empirically. What ontological status does evil have? How can you use the existence of non-existence to try and disprove the existence of the necessary existence? It's a waste of time. And we've got 20 seconds here. And in that time, I will just recite Quran. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, which is, say He's Allah, one and only, Allahu Samad. The one who everyone depends upon, He depends upon nothing. لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. He begets not, nor is He begotten. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There's nothing like Him. جزاكم خيرا.
Our next panelist is Mark Oppenheimer.
Well, I thought that was a marvelous place to end off, talking about the question of evil. While Aaron has spoken about the arguments for and against the existence of God, I'm going to talk about why atheists can talk about the existence of morality and why they give a better account of morality. Now, the first place to start is to say, well, what would a good moral theory look like? Well, firstly, we should know what it requires of us. In other words, the theory tells us what we ought to do in the world, what's permissible, what's not permissible. It should cohere with our ordinary intuitions. So if it prohibits things that we think are good or neutral, that's a problem for the theory. If it allows things that we think are repugnant or bad, that's also a problem for the theory. It must be consistent. The theory mustn't be at odds with itself. It shouldn't require you to do X and also not X. We also think that it should be universal, that we can take the moral theory and we can apply it across history and across the world, and we can make moral judgments, and it'll tell us that certain things were wrong, even if people at the time believed them to be right. So, for example, it was a case that throughout human history, slavery was practiced. A lot of people believed that slavery was a moral practice, and a good moral theory should tell you that those people were wrong, that slavery is always wrong and can never be justifiable. So that's what a good moral theory should do. Now, Hamza has in his book a theistic account of what morality requires of us and what a good moral theory is, and the claim is really that God is the foundation of morality. And he takes the divine command theory approach. So we say whatever God commands, that is what's right. Now, this is dealt with in what's called Euthyphro's dilemma. There's two horns of the dilemma. The first is it good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it is good? Sorry, there's a terrible beeping sound. If someone could turn that off, I'd really appreciate it. So, the horn dilemma is, does God command it because it is good? Or is it good because God commands it? Now, if it's good because God commands it, you run into this arbitrariness problem, which is that God could command anything. God could say, kill the firstborn, and it would be good because God had commanded it. God could say that the right thing to do is wear purple underwear on a Tuesday, something that we think is neutral, and it would be good because God commands it. So there's the arbitrariness problem. If you take the other horn of the dilemma, which is that God knows what is good, and therefore that's why he commands it, then the foundation of morality doesn't stem from God's commands, but it's external to God. Now, in his book, Hamza takes another move to say, well, actually, there's a third option, which is to say that God's nature is good, and that's why whatever stems from God's commands is good. The problem with this approach is that really it just moves the problem one step back. So we can ask, are the things that are in God's nature good because they're in God's nature, or are they good because of an external standard? So God could have a series of character traits. God could be vicious and spiteful and jealous. And we'd say, well, they're in God's nature, therefore they're good. And that would, of course, not cohere with our ordinary sense of what goodness is. Or we could say, God has a series of attributes that match our external standards of goodness. So relocating the problem to God's nature doesn't get you out of this. So what does secular ethics have to offer? Well, the atheist has a number of different approaches. They're not necessarily required to believe in one particular ethical system. There's a variety that are available to them. I'm going to give you a couple that I think are very plausible. So the first one is grounded in the idea that we all suffer. That suffering is something that all of us have experienced, that when we see suffering, we think that it is lamentable and bad, that we try to prevent suffering, that we ought not to go and inflict suffering upon others. And I think that there's a very good moral theory that can come out of that. In other words, we think that if you were to pull out a baby's eyeballs just for the fun of it and cause the baby to suffer, we don't need to ask why that's wrong. We know innately that suffering is a bad thing. We might think that the morality supervenes upon the fact of the suffering, and that is a good reason not to do that to the baby. And that it wouldn't matter which deity commanded you to go and pull the eyeballs out of the baby, it would be wrong. Another account that you can have is grounded in the nature of beings. So morality can extend not just to humans but to animals. Animals we know can suffer, for example, and we might have obligations to animals not to cause needless suffering to them. But if we think about humans for a minute, I think that humans have this capacity for rationality. that you can reason through various ideas, and because of that you can create what Immanuel Kant calls universal laws. So one path to secular morality is in the categorical imperative, where Kant says, can you will a law that if universalized you would be able to operate upon? So the idea is, can I will that it's okay to lie to someone in order to extract money from them? And he says, well, imagine a world in which everybody lied. Just
We're going to stop for...
Sure.
Sorry, we're trying to...
Moderator,
Let's do this. We will continue. Mark, you have 10 more minutes. While we try to sort this out, apologies again for the interruption. So we'll settle down. Mark, you have 10 minutes remaining. I'm going to add 1 minute for you. But okay, it seems like it's finally offline.
Well, as a demonstration of my point that suffering is bad. So that's our first secular account, that the presence of suffering is bad, it is an evil and condemnable, and you can build a moral theory based on the presence of suffering, that you ought not to cause it to other people, that you ought to try and alleviate it when you see it. And thank you so much for alleviating that suffering that we've all been enduring for the last 10 minutes. Here's a second account that you can have, which is sourced in rationality. So Immanuel Kant comes up with the categorical imperative. So the idea is that there are universal laws that can guide us, that tell us what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. So for example, if you have the maxim that it is okay to lie to someone in order to cheat them out of money, Kant says, well, you need to universalize the maxim. So imagine a world in which everybody lied to everybody else in order to deceive them into handing over money. What would happen in such a world? No one would believe each other, no one would hand over the money. So the maxim would fail. So just through the process of rationality, you can see that you cannot will such a law into existence, which is that it's okay to lie in order to extract money. John Rawls has a contemporary account of how you can source morality. So imagine this case. You're lying in a hospital bed, you're covered head to toe in bandages, and you've got quite a severe case of amnesia. So you can't recall your sex, your race, your faith, but you have a basic understanding of economics and history. Doctor walks into the room and he says, I'm going to give you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm going to let you set the rules for the world that you step into. But you've got to set the rules first before I take off the bandages. And so you think, I need to act in my own self-interest. So what if I introduced a rule that men have more power than women, or that whites ought to get more property than blacks? Well, maybe if I take off the bandages, I'll wind up being a black woman. So I wouldn't produce such a rule. And so he thinks under this veil of ignorance that you will then generate a set of rules that we track common sense morality. So there you have three different secular accounts that don't require the existence of God, that I think meet those criteria quite well in terms of what is a good moral theory. They're consistent, they cohere with our intuitions, and there's an advantage as well in that you can make adjustments. If you are dealing with something divine, the idea is that the text that was granted to us is immutable. That if it says things which no longer cohere with our common sense intuitions, we either have to try and pretend that they're not there, we have to try and interpret our way out of them, but we're bound by the text. And at some point it starts to look audacious when you're trying to talk around some things that are clear in the text. The secular moral theorist says, well, we were mistaken in the past, that our moral theory wasn't very good. Let's make some adjustments. So you find, for example, that the growth of moral theory is to be more inclusive, to say that our obligations to others extend not just to people of particular sexes or faiths or religions, but to everybody. That we have this of growing egalitarianism. So now I've given you those accounts, and I'm going to talk about some particular moral requirements in the Quran. But first, I'd just like it if that door could be closed, because it's very loud again. Please close the door and not talk. Thank you. Again, you can see the presence of suffering as an evil. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of Sharia law, and I'm open to in the conversation, if I've gotten anything wrong, or if I've given a bad account of the law, please correct me. Let's start with the idea of being an apostate. The idea that if you are Muslim, that you have an obligation to stay in the faith, not leave the faith, and not to rebuke the faith. Now, one of the most well-known apostates, or those accused of being an apostate, was Salman Rushdie. Rushdie wrote the book The Satanic Verses in 1989. It's an enormously popular bestseller, and I think most people are aware of the fact that the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a legal opinion, saying that because of the blasphemous content in the book, and because of the fact that he was a Muslim, that it is the obligation of all Muslims, when they see him, to kill him. And I'm going to read just a little short extract from that fatwa. We are from Allah, and to Allah we shall return. I'm informing all brave Muslims of the world that the author of the Satanic Verses, a text written, edited and published against Islam, the Prophet of Islam and the Quran, along with all the editors and publishers aware of its contents, are condemned to death. I call on all valiant Muslims, wherever they may be in the world, to kill them without delay, so that no one will dare insult the sacred beliefs of Muslims henceforth. And whoever is killed in this cause will be a martyr, Allah willing. Meanwhile, if someone has access to the author of the book but is incapable of carrying out the execution, he should inform the people so that Rushdie is punished for his actions. Now, the source in the Quran for this view was in chapter 9, verse 61. Some of them heard the Prophet by saying, he is all ears. Say, it is better for you that he listens to you. He believes in God and trusts the believers. He is a mercy for those among you who believe. Those who hurt God's messenger have incurred a painful retribution. Now, there is some debate in the community about whether or not this was a legitimately issued penalty, whether there should have been a trial. We know that Rushdie was driven to hiding for many, many years, up until last year when he gave a talk in America, and while giving the talk was publicly attacked on stage and his eye was gouged out. So I invite my friends to deal with this question. Is it wrong to be an apostate? Was the punishment fitting? It seems that that doesn't cohere with our ordinary requirements of moral philosophy. In other words, the atheist would never punish someone who ceased to be an atheist, who became a believer, a polytheist or a theist of any sort. We can then think about the publication Charlie Hebdo. So many of the writers and cartoonists of that publication in France were violently executed on the grounds that they had produced depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, again, there's some debate as to whether or not it is permissible at all to produce such depictions, but it seems that if there is such a rule, it can only bind believers in the faith. And to say that those who have breached the rule, who are non-believers, deserve death, strikes me as contrary to our ordinary moral intuitions. Now, what does the Quran say about people who are non-believers? Well, in chapter 5, verse 10 says, as for those who disbelieve and deny our signs, they are the residents of the hellfire. As for disbelievers, even if they were to possess everything in the world twice over and offer it to ransom themselves from the punishment of the day of judgment, it would never be accepted from them, and they will suffer a painful punishment. They will be desperate to get out of the fire, but they will never be able to. They will suffer an everlasting punishment. And to those who say Allah is one in a Trinity, in other words, Christians, have certainly fallen into disbelief. There is only one God. If they do not stop saying this, those who disbelieve among them will be afflicted with a painful punishment. Now, again, it seems odd to think that you should have eternal hellfire, eternal suffering, for failure to believe in a particular God. No secular religion no secular viewpoint would ever require this. Also think that punishments ought to fit crimes, so that there ought to be a level of proportionality, and that there is a failing in this regard. So, chapter 5, verse 33 says, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and spread mischief in the land is death, crucifixion, cutting off their hands and feet on opposite sides, or exile from the land. This penalty is a disgrace for them in this world, and they will suffer a tremendous punishment in the hereafter. The commentary says that in the case of armed robbery, offenders' right hands and left feet are to be cut off. Now, there are some circumscribed ways in which these penalties will be imposed, that you should have people who can testify, you can prove it, things you might expect in a court of law. But I would think that no moral court system would impose your hands being cut off for the crime of theft. We can all accept that theft is wrong, but it must be proportional punishment. In other words, maybe you think a custodial sentence, maybe you think a fine, but having your hands removed seems disproportionate. Now, with regards to sexual ethics, there are some further problems. Chapter 24:2 says, as for female and male fornicators, give each of them 100 lashes, and do not let pity for them to make you lenient in enforcing the law of Allah. If you truly believe in Allah and the last day, let a number of believers witness their punishment. Now, what about having sex with a woman while she's menstruating? The commentary on its 4:16 says that one who goes into a woman in menstruation or in her anus or goes to a soothsayer and accepts his statement relating to the unknown, then such people have rejected what is revealed to Muhammad. As for a fixed punishment for this evil act, there is a difference of opinions among Muslim jurists, details of which are available in the books of fiqh. Nevertheless, the nature of such punishments reported by them is as severe as it can be, such as burning into fire, bashing under a wall felled over, throwing down from a height, stoning and beheading with the sword. Now, what about homosexuality? Well, again, this is condemned, and the idea is that it is deserving of death. Now, it's not just theoretically deserving of death, that it is practiced in a number of countries that have Sharia law, that gay people are executed. Now, one line is to say, well, it's okay to be gay, we just have a problem with the act of homosexuality. But a secular account of morality is going to say, well, have you caused anyone to suffer by engaging in a consensual act of homosexual sex? No. Have you violated any rights? No. If you were to sit in the veil of ignorance and imagine that you yourself may very well be a homosexual who would like to have loving relationships and sex with others, would you want such a rule that would impose the death penalty upon you? No. So there is a difficulty in that the actual moral views that are expressed in the Quran don't meet what we require of a good moral theory. That they're out of accordance with our intuitions, that they're non-revisable because the claim is that they come from a divine source, and that secular morality provides us with a much better, richer account that can be claimed to be metaphysically true through a multiple range of sources, either through the presence of suffering. It strikes me as a very interesting move that my friend has made to say there is no evil in the world. I would imagine that spending some time being tied up and tortured to death, you would very quickly think there is evil in the world and I'd like to resist it. To claim that there is no evil is such an outlandish claim. It's just said to be entirely amoral, and I think not in coherence with our ordinary intuitions about the nature of reality. But I look forward to a robust discussion. I run the channel Brain in the Vat, which is the philosophy discussion channel with Jason Werbelov, and the nature of our show is such that we try to engage each other in a polite, civil way so that we can both find out what's actually true. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our final esteemed panelist is Hamza Jordis. Go ahead.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon every single one of you. So before I get into my argument for God's existence that undermines naturalism, which goes against the idea that naturalism explains reality, and by the way, naturalism cannot explain the hard problem of consciousness, the acquisition of language, objective moral values, and there's a whole list of recalcitrant facts against the naturalistic paradigm. To say that it explains the whole of reality is quite bizarre. But notwithstanding, I'd like to just make a few points. We're going to address every single one of your assertions. But the first point I'd like to say is, with regards to the problem of evil argument, it's a totally false argument. It misrepresents Islamic theism because it assumes that evil has some kind of ontological reality. Evil is real from the perspective of that it exists in our world, but ontologically it's based on the goodness and wisdom of the divine, which undermines some key premises of that argument. Also from the perspective of suffering under a naturalistic account, well, what is suffering? It's just electrons whizzing around. Cold, blind, non-conscious, non-intentional electrons whizzing around. So from a naturalistic paradigm, just like what Richard Dawkins says, and I have respect for him on this particular matter, because he's consistent. In his book he says, it's pitless indifference. No good, no evil. Also, you've strawed man my argument concerning Euthyphro's dilemma. I didn't say God is only good. I said God is good, but the way we argue that, because he's the only deity worthy of worship, and the only deity worthy of worship is the highest form of good, which we could unpack. But also we have another argument against Euthyphro's dilemma. It is a false dilemma, because there is no external standard that Allah has to submit to. And although it is good because God commanded it, his commands are not arbitrary. They're not dislocated away from his nature. That's a false assumption. And also when we look at the reality of God's commands, we see they cannot be arbitrary unless you want to believe that something could come from nothing, or something well designed is actually based on some kind of randomness. And let me explain. God's commands, manifested in Islamic moral and legal law, addresses the moral needs of human beings on a personal, social, and political level. We have over 1,000 years of a great society. Secularism has only existed for what, 90 years or 100 years, maybe more, and we've seen more bloodshed under secularism than any other moment, time, and phase in history. But notwithstanding, the commands of God are like a key that perfectly fit in a lock that opens the door to well-being and functioning for individuals and social harmony. A key is designed for a lock. And just like the key is designed for a lock, the commands of God are designed for our well-being. Therefore, it's completely irrational and absurd to claim that God's commands are arbitrary. To argue that they are arbitrary is equivalent of claiming that a specific key that opens a specific door was actually not designed for that function. So, there's much more to say, so much things were going on, but let me start with what I call the Quranic argument of prior cognitive information. And today, my dear brothers and sisters and friends, I will argue that Islamic theism makes sense of our ability to produce thought and rational judgments. I would argue that the very fact that atheists are interlocutors, can have a thought, can have a judgment, whether it's sound or not, and there's been very unsound reasoning going on today. But the point is, the very fact that you can have a thought and you can have a judgment requires God's existence in the first place. So it's quite interesting that atheists think about denying God, but that very cognitive process requires God in the first place. And now, if I have time, I'm going to talk about why God is worthy of worship. And this argument is from the Quran, and the best arguments are from the Quran. If you go to chapter 2, verses 30 to 33, Allah says, He taught Adam the names of things. Then He presented them to the angels and said, tell me the names of these if what you say is true. They replied, glory be to you. You have no knowledge except what you taught us. You are truly the all-knowing, the wise. Allah said, O Adam, inform them of the names. Then when Adam did, Allah said, did I not tell you that I know the secrets of the heavens and the earth, and I know what you reveal and what you conceal? And the exegetical understanding of this is not just names, but it's concepts, natures, realities, and properties of things. So here's the argument. And by the way, this argument has been taken from my friend and my teacher, Dr. Safruk Chowdhury. He's a well-known academic, and he actually published a paper on this particular topic. So here are the premises. Number one, prior cognitive information is necessary for humans to formulate judgments about things. Number two, the ultimate source of prior cognitive information is either from a human, a non-human, animal, an inanimate object, natural selection, chance, or a non-natural source. Number three, the ultimate source of prior cognitive information cannot be from a human, a non-human animal, an inanimate object, natural selection, or chance. Four, which is the conclusion, it must be from a natural source. And we have two more conclusions. Five, the most plausible non-natural source for prior cognitive information must be a transcendent agent cause that has the property of omniscience, life, and intelligence. And it finally follows, conclusion 6, the non-natural agent cause in 5 that we just mentioned makes sense of the God of Islamic theism. Now here's some preliminary points. The argument that I'm producing today is not claiming that necessarily at every historical stage of human development that it required some kind of supernatural pedagogical agent. I'm saying that the original human required that prior cognitive input. And this is very important. It's like a causal argument, a first causal argument from a prior cognitive input perspective. Also, the premises that I have unpacked, they're not kind of something that naturalists would necessarily disagree with, because we even have in the empiricist and nativist debate a discussion of kind of an innate cognitive apparatus with some kind of linguistic cognitive biases. Now, even the empiricists agree that you do require some nativism, but they're not as extreme, if you like, as the nativists themselves. Also, and just to repeat, we're talking about the initial human being requiring that pedagogical source that gave the prior cognitive information that is required for us to have judgments and thoughts. So let's go back to premise 1 to unpack. Prior cognitive information is necessary for human beings to formulate judgments about things. Now, the capacity to think, the capacity to have thoughts and to have rational judgments or unsound and sound judgments, you require at least 4 conditions. A reality external to the agent, or a perceived reality. Number 2, sense faculties that sense the reality. Number 3, a properly functioning brain that differentiates the sense reality. And 4, prior cognitive information. If any of these conditions are absent, you cannot have thought, you cannot have judgment. And also, you have to have prior cognitive information in some sense to be able to link that prior cognitive information to that sense reality in order to have a thought and a judgment. Without that, all you're going to have is sensation and sensation and sensation. You're not going to have thought or any form of judgment and adequate cognition. And we can unpack that in the Q&A. Premise number 2. The ultimate source of prior cognitive information is either from a human, non-human animal, inanimate object, chance, natural selection, or a non-natural source. So let's go to human beings. Well, the prior cognitive information that is necessary for thinking could not have come ultimately from another human being. Why? Because we could ask, where did that human being get that prior cognitive information from? And to continue that chain, you have an absurdity of an infinite regress. Non-human animals. Well, we'll be hard-pressed to give examples of an intelligent account of how a non-human animal species could have meaningfully interacted with human beings based on some pedagogical setup or approach. It might exist in the future with some postmodern secular ethics. We'll be marrying animals soon. That's what happens when you change your ethics based on your own desires and your false understanding of suffering. But the point is, we don't have that setup at the moment, and God forbid it happens in the future. And if it were true that some kind of animal gave us that prior cognitive information or input, well, at the end of the day, it goes back to the regress problem. Where did that animal get that prior cognitive information from? And we know that the infinite regress is absurd, therefore this is not an adequate explanation. What about inanimate objects? Well, inanimate objects do not have cognitive abilities or functions or the ability to teach, instruct, or pass on cognitive information. Just like under naturalism, you can't adequately explain language development. You can't adequately explain the fact that we have inner subjective conscious experiences, because fundamentally under this physicalist reality, it's just blind, cold, non-intentional processes. And at the end of the day, when you have blind, cold, non-intentional processes, you have to now start to explain how we could develop language, how we could develop cognition, how we could develop inner subjective conscious experience. And that is going to be interesting debate. So inanimate objects fail. What about 4, chance? Well, let's cite Dr. Safrak Chowdhury, because he actually gives a beautiful undercutting defeater to this possibility. He says, the major problem with this possibility is that it's not remotely clear how chance can do anything. Chance is not metaphysically a thing, an entity. It has no being and is not a cognizing potency or power. It is a term that is inadvertently endowed with a creative power and efficacy. In fact, for chance to be a candidate for inputting prior cognitive information would be to granted an all-pervasive power reserved only for something that we would describe as living. To do this, however, is to commit the fallacy of rarefication, which consists of attributing concrete characteristics to something non-concrete or abstract. By arguing that chance did X, created Y, and selected Z, obscures something deeply taking place, and that is making chance a cause when it is mere mathematical possibilities in abstracto. In effect, to attribute chance as a cause for originating prior cognitive information is tantamount to saying nothing originated prior cognitive information. What about natural selection? Well, this fails because there is no necessary link between survival, reproduction, and the ability to even have thoughts and sound or unsound judgments. Look at cockroaches. They survive, they reproduce, but they're not here talking about the inner dimensions of spirituality or theism and atheism or debating about moral theory. Cockroaches are just cockroaches, and unfortunately we do have the human cockroaches in the world that cause a lot of suffering, and unfortunately many of them have been naturalists and secularists. But nevertheless, and one would also argue that there is no necessary link between survival and production and even having true reliable cognitive faculties. For example, if I'm the first human, or I'm part of the evolutionary chain, I'm one of your ancestors that walk into a jungle and I have the false belief based on the unreliable cognitive faculties that mushrooms are poisonous, I'm going to survive. But is it true that all mushrooms are poisonous? Of course not. Now the atheists may retort and say, what about evolutionary reliabilism? This is the view that it's more likely for natural selection to select traits that formed cognitive faculties that were reliable and produced true beliefs over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. However, I will reply by saying, where's your evidence? Why the epistemic privilege? Why? And when you look at the empirical evidence, with all due respect, you have to be radical skeptics, and therefore there is no truth. The claim there is no God, the claim that there is evil, you have to be radical skeptical about these categories. In actual fact, you have to turn into a postmodernist. Now the reason I'm saying this is because when you look at the works of James Sage and many others, and you look at cognitive science today, they're saying that having true empirical perceptions is not conducive to survival and production. So we have to have false perceptions or not totally accurate perceptions. Also, the very fact that you think that you have to have true beliefs that are reliable, and we were developed that way, and selective forces selected those traits is completely incoherent. Why? Because of the fact that when you use your brain to a certain degree, it drains your resources to make specific inferences and deductions, drains your biological resources. In actual fact, it's more conducive to survival and reproduction to do what? To make false generalizations that would facilitate survival and reproduction. We could cite James Sage much later. So, conclusion number 4. Therefore, it must be from something non-natural. Since all the possible naturalistic explanations to explain prior cognitive information fail, the reasonable conclusion is that to explain prior cognitive information is to cite a non-naturalistic explanation. And the non-naturalistic explanation, and this is the conclusion 5 and 6, is that it has to be a non-natural transcendent agent that has the property of omniscience, life and intelligence. Why must it be living? Because an inanimate object does not contain prior cognitive information, and it doesn't have the ability to instruct the prior cognitive information. And a living being is a rational precondition for possessing any pedagogical attributes. As Allah says, Allah, there is no deity except Him, the ever-living, in chapter 2, 255. It must be transcendent. Why? Because it has to transcend the regress, otherwise it would also require prior cognitive information. As Allah says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. In chapter 41, verse 11, there is nothing like Him. Also, He must be willing, because this means it must be a kind of being that chooses what it wants to do, so it can willingly select the prior cognitive information relevant to and necessary for human cognitive success or any other functional objective. And a choice indicates a will. As Allah says in the Quran in chapter 76 verse 30, but you cannot will to do so unless Allah wills. And finally, it must be omniscient. This living, willing, transcendent agent cause must possess immense knowledge to endow it to other intelligent bearing agents. It must also consciously select all relevant initial cognitive input and justify that selection. As Allah says in the Quran, surely Allah is all-knowing, all-aware, in chapter 31 verse 34. And this makes sense of the traditional God in theism in general and also Islamic theism. And finally, conclude, atheism cannot even start to explain the fact that we can think, have thoughts and judgments. They don't have the key to open the door to rationality. Why? Because atheism as philosophical naturalism has already been dealt with in this presentation. Atheism as a form of evolutionary reliabilism has been dealt with in this presentation. Atheism as a form of scientism has also been dealt with in this presentation because naturalist selection fails. Atheism as a form of postmodernism, well, postmodern principle of knowledge, there is no method to come to an objective truth. Therefore, there is no truth, it's radically skeptical. So you can't even explain truth, thought, judgments itself. Atheism is a priori, it's a priori. It's a first principle. It's a metaphysic. We start with the fact that we trust our reliable cognitive faculties. We say they're reliable. Well, if you're going to play that game, the door swings both ways. Islam's truths are a priori too. But what would you rather choose as a rational agent? A comprehensive explanation of reality that explains your ability to form judgments, and you could claim that that's a priori, or another so-called a priori that can't even explain our ability to think and form judgments. So brothers and sisters and friends, atheism is a failed project in every shape and form. All manifestations of atheism, it can't even explain our ability to have cognition, to think, to form rational judgments. And at the end of the day, the atheist and physicalist universe just reduces the human being to blind, cold, non-intentional physical processes, and it's all pitless indifference. And I would suggest that interlocutors become more consistent and coherent with their worldview and just say, there is no good, there is no evil, there is no right, there is no wrong. Why is truth a value? Because in the empirical world, it's all valueless anyway. Electrons whizzing around. Thank you very much.